Welcome to the Propel Podcast, inspiration and innovation to grow your church. I'm your host, Larry Witzel. If God is giving you big dreams for growing his kingdom, then this podcast is for you. Our goal with this podcast is to offer practical training for effective evangelism in the Seventh-day Adventist ministry context, but we know that the principles we talk about here are applicable in many other churches as well. So wherever you're doing ministry, welcome to the Propel Podcast. If you enjoy the Propel Podcast, please leave us a review. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to share this with your ministry colleagues. Your support really helps our mission to inspire and innovate church growth. This episode features Dr. Jason Canfield, the senior pastor of the Puyallup Seventh-day Adventist Church. Jason has a passion for helping others experience the life-changing truths found in Christ. He has a really diverse background. 6 years of missionary work in Southeast Asia, over 20 years of pastoral ministry, experience in business, advanced theological degrees. He has a unique upbringing in the Mormon faith. I've known Dr. Canfield for over a decade, and I've really appreciated his cross-cultural perspective and his desire to be a bridge between the different generations. And he and his family were actually an inspiration to my own family when they moved to Taiwan for a couple of years, leading us to spend time ourselves outside the country. And I'm grateful that he was willing to bring this broad and insightful perspective to the Propel Conference. In his presentation, Dr. Canfield highlights the importance of understanding generational culture and language in ministry. In a lot of ways, intergenerational ministry really is cross-cultural ministry. He emphasizes tailoring biblical teachings to each generation's unique preferences. And by providing examples of generational preferences for giving and worship, he suggests ways to engage all age groups in ministry. Dr. Canfield encourages pastors to develop generational intelligence and adapt their methods to effectively reach and retain different generations. Before we begin today's episode, I want to give a special shout out to this episode's sponsor, the Oregon Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. If you're seeking a community dedicated to spiritual growth, meaningful worship, and impactful service, the Oregon Conference is the place for you. Join over 36,000 like-minded members from 134 churches who share your passion for faith and fellowship. With a variety of programs and events designed to enrich your spiritual journey, you'll find opportunities to connect, learn, and grow. And whether you're new to the faith or looking to deepen your relationship with Christ, the Oregon Conference welcomes you with open arms. Visit OregonAdventist.org to learn more and to become part of this supportive community today. Okay, let's begin Dr. Jason Canfield's session at the 2024 Propel Conference. His topic, Generational Intelligence for Evangelism and Retention.
So a little bit of my background. So I was sharing a little bit. I was born and raised Mormon in southern Utah. Quite a conversion. I won't go through all those details, but then I ended up spending 6 years in the mission field, living over in Asia, between South Korea, the Philippines, as well as Taipei, Taiwan. I bring this up because one of the things about when I was going overseas is one of the key things they tell, if you ever want to reach a particular people group, you need to learn a bit about their culture. You need to learn maybe the language. If it's a different language, language embodies a lot of culture. And recently, I finished my doctorate of ministry through Andrews in intergenerational church. And one of the things I began to realize is that every single generation actually has a unique culture, a unique language. They have different preferences. They want scripture communicated to them in different ways. It's not all identical. I believe there is a truth that supersedes all of that, but it can be helpful to understand a little bit more about what people are going through within each generation to know better how to express the biblical truths to them. So you got a timeless truth that needs to be presented in a timely way to them to help them to understand where they're coming from. So this is a little bit of generational intelligence, if you will, understanding who the congregation is, even if they all look the same. You could have a congregation that is filled with nothing but Caucasians, and you could have cultural conflict everywhere, including within the family. And one of the things we've done as a church, not that it's bad, but just to think about the retention elements of it. If you think about children, we separate them off when they're young from cradle roll or beginners, whatever you call it in your church. And then they're with kids their age all the way up through, all the way through elementary, all the way through high school. And they're in this context where they're around basically people that act and think the way they think. They go off to college, the college university churches, nothing but people their age, thinking and acting the way they do. They leave, and then you're wondering how they leave the university, which is where we have the highest dropout of people out of the faith, because they can't go to a church and find everybody that thinks and acts and talks just like them. So we've kind of created a bit of a monster in that we have not always integrated all the different ages and generations together or tried to speak to them. In general, there's about 2 key generations that run the church. If you look at the General Conference, NAD, the leadership is mostly at a certain age because of education and whatnot. So there's a lot that goes into this. Here's Dr. Trim from the General Conference said, from 1965 to 2020, in an average state, 30% of the members left the church. Worldwide, 62% of members leave the church at young adult age. So have you experienced that in your church? Do you guys have a lot of young adults? Not too many? So hopefully this will help you know better how to speak to them and reach them in that way. So the teens, they say, cannot leave the church because they are stuck with the parents. We've all probably seen that, where they're there, they're not really excited to be there, they may not want to be there, they're on their phone their entire time, they're criticized, spoken down to because they're already gone, if you will. They're just present. In a survey of former Adventists, 72% joined our church because of doctrinal truth. More than half of them still read the Bible regularly, and 60% believe in Ellen G. White. What this means is that these members leave due to friendship, which was reiterated again just this morning. People may have joined the church due to truth, but it's the friendships that keep them in the church. And one of the things I have found, and I think it makes a big difference, is trying to connect the different generations within your church. So where I'm at right now in Puyallup, last year we had over 40 baptisms. Tithe and offering went up 33%. The entire time I was at my previous church, we were one of 3 churches that were growing clear through COVID. I believe these principles can be implemented as a core value, but it doesn't mean that it has to cost a lot of money. I wasn't doing public evangelism clear through COVID, but I had churches that were growing and thriving, applying some of these principles. So, do you guys know what generations you are? Old. An old generation? Boomer, Xer?
Zillennial. I was born in 1980.
Zillennial. So yeah, another term they use now is a cusper. Have you ever heard that term?
No, I haven't.
So a cusper is when you're on the cusp of one generation and the next. And so sometimes you blend a little bit of the two. You're like, well, I'm not really Gen Z, I'm not really millennial, I'm somewhere in the middle. And it depends on also the dynamic in which you grew up in, what were your parents like, what kind of culture did they have. Sometimes people, I was raised, for example, by silent generation. My dad was 50 by the time I was born, big Mormon family, youngest of 10. So our dynamics were, all my siblings were boomers. I'm technically a Gen X millennial cusper. But it makes a difference in how you relate to people and what they do. So basic concept, I know this is really basic coming back to the point, but it's just to kind of get a foundation as we move forward. So a generation is just a group of people who are connected by their place and time with a common boundaries and a common character. A generational persona embodies attitudes about family life, gender roles, institutions, politics, religion, culture, lifestyle, and the future. Each generation possesses a personal biography. So I mean, most of these you can see very true in your church. If you have young people, I was talking, I don't think he's here now, with someone a little earlier that, when I was growing up, no one ever asked me what my gender was. Right. I didn't have to think about that. To me, it was, well, you look down, you know what you are, and that's it. But generations today are growing up where they think, well, you can't just be so narrow-minded. They would think you're being shallow and you're not loving them because there's a concept that if you don't endorse what they do, that maybe you're against them. And so when it comes to the generations, understanding a little bit about them, where they're coming from, what they're going through in life can play a role in how you minister to them. And I'll show you this a little bit more in just a second here. So they would say, this is effective generational ministry, page 20 says, each generation takes for granted the good, reacts against the bad, and responds within their own historical context. I think all of us could probably say at some point, I've heard my father in me and cringed because I sounded a little bit like him sometimes in ways that I didn't expect to. In other ways, I'm very thankful for some of the things they did. Maybe it makes a difference that I was coming from a different religious background, but have you ever seen things come out in your kids that you're like, oh, did they mimic me in that? Or maybe you did it from your parents. So we often take for granted the good that we get, and we react against the bad. So most people I talk to, they will say, well, I'm never going to do such and such and such and such, because that's the things they didn't like from their parents. So what you end up seeing happen is generations have kind of a pendulum swinging like this, constantly from one generation to the next. Some people would say there are basically 4 cycles that generations go through, depending on who you're talking to. Just to give you a quick breakdown, there are numerous names for the different generations, but here's a rough idea of them. The silent generation goes from 78 to 99. You probably have a few of these people in your church. Boomers are often the majority in the church. In many churches these days, because as soon as you hit Gen X and on, it starts to diminish rapidly. So you have Gen X, sometimes also called busters. You have millennials or Gen Y. There's a couple of other names that they use for them. Gen Z is probably what's getting a lot of attention right now. And Gen Alpha, the natural sequence of we hit the end of the alphabet, so we're going to start over, is the youngest. We don't know exactly what they're going to be like. There's not a lot of data because they're just kids. And so knowing a lot about them is a little bit difficult. Hayden Shaw said this, and I have the book here, Generation IQ, a great basic book for understanding. To fulfill God's purpose in our congregations, we will need to figure out how to speak the languages of the different generations. Have you ever thought about the fact that there's a very different language for each generation? Idioms, phrases, selfies or being ghosted might be something newer terminology that didn't exist back when you were a kid. Nobody took selfies because we didn't have smartphones to do it. So the language has changed. What they're experiencing changes, and because things are changing so rapidly, we're getting more and more shifts, and older generations are struggling to keep up. Technology is just rapidly going. I find most of us, the last class that was in here was dealing with what is it called? Artificial intelligence, AI, for ministry. I don't know that I would have ever conceived that that was going to be a reality in my lifetime. It's fascinating now that you can tell a computer or even your phone to write a dissertation on a topic. I tried it just for fun on my own topic, and it was pretty darn good. It actually had most of the same resources I put in my dissertation, and I didn't write a word of it. I told it how many pages, how many references, and it just does it. Which begs the question of where are we headed and what's happening. When I was a kid, if we wanted to learn something, we had this old set of Encyclopedia Britannica. Anybody grow up with those? And if you want to know something, you go back and you get the book because that's the resource and that's where you find the facts. Now, that's not the case anymore. So I have a 23 and a 25-year-old daughter. My about to be a grandfather in December, and it's fascinating to me that when I've tried to talk to my daughter that's pregnant, she said, well, I'm not going to read a book on what to expect when you're expecting or any of these type of things. TikTok will tell me everything I need to know. It's a different world, right? So she doesn't feel like she has the time to read through it. She'd be bored by half of it, so she just needs to find people that will tell it to her. And so they're speaking in not only the language, but in through the correct channels that those people are accessing. And this is where the understanding the generations and the technology and all these different things come into play if we're really going to reach them and retain them. He basically says the real God is amazing, so we need to be able to explain him to the next generation. Throughout Scripture, there's this constant context of you need to tell what God has done to your children and their children and their children. The challenge we're having is with the generations that are existing today in most of our churches, it's rapidly declining by age. So if something doesn't shift, we are not headed in the correct direction. Does that make sense? Does that seem true in most of your churches?
They're trying to make the Gen Z Bible.
Yes, I have heard of that.
I'm not giving that to my kids.
And no, you're not. So we don't have to succumb to everything they're saying, but we do need to know how to package our truth in a way that they will take it. Does that make sense? So you're fighting against the worldly version of their culture, which is very prominent to them. It's everybody they're around. And one of the challenges I had in my last church, for example, I went in and worked with the youth on a regular basis in the Sabbath school. And it started because the leader said, hey, pastor, can you come talk to the youth? They have some questions, and frankly, I don't want to answer them. And I was like, what do you mean by that? So I get in there, and they turned it into an Ask the Pastor time, and I ended up in that class for probably 3 months straight. Because it was, what is right or wrong? Let's talk about free choice, where it could be pro-life or it could be pro-abortion. Let's talk about what does it mean with gender? Where does gender come from? Is it really only the two? Well, what's really happening with these people? And talking about gender attractions, all these things that if your church is anything like most I've been in, you can't preach on that very easily. Anybody ever preached on transgenderism or any of those types of topics in your church? Not likely. So the question is if we are not speaking about it from the pulpit, where is the venue where they can have those questions? Can they get a biblical answer? So this is probably more for your high school level kids, maybe the late middle schoolers. But you need to build places where you can have some of those conversations, because if you don't have it with them, the only voice they're going to hear is what TikTok and their friends say. And so if we're not speaking into them in their lives, where they're at and with what they need, we may lose them entirely. Generational languages, it's kind of an interesting topic here, and I've got numerous books on this, and I've done some of my own studies with my dissertation. They would say the silent generation, it wants a traditional approach, very truthful oriented. This is just the language that is used. Boomers kind of liked a little bit of skeptical, a little bit of tease. And I'll get to what that means a little bit later. This is coming from them. Gen Xers were intellectual. They wanted validation. So they look at things in a different way because society began to collapse a little bit. Presidents were having issues. They weren't sure. All of a sudden there were these extra biblical books and the Gnostic Gospels and all these different things. So they began to question everything, and they look at things more of an intellectual level. Millennials, it was very dialogical, open-ended. The world has grown to where they all have friends from different religions and different countries. And so to say we're the only ones that are right strikes them as blasphemy and too much, and they don't want to hear it because they are more open-ended, and it has to be more of a conversation than a truth traditional fact base. Make sense? You guys can ask questions anytime as we go through. And then Gen Zers, it's more relational and they want authenticity. So what's interesting with all of this is if you're authentic and saying you're having a struggle from the pulpit and having an open-ended conversation with your young people, these people up here are not happy with you. Because their understanding of what a pastor is not the same thing you're talking about. So what we end up happening is they come at things differently. And so one of the things that is helpful to do is to help the generations understand that they're just generational preferences. It's not so much a right and a wrong. Does that make sense? There definitely is a right and wrong, but how they want to worship, how they want messages related to them differs. Let me show you just a quick, simple way of looking at this. So this is the example of hearing John 3:16. Take the most famous Bible verse of Scripture. So when they put all of these different varieties of answers out there with the generations, the silent generation, when they read John 3:16, so God so loves the world that he gave his only begotten son, they want to know Jesus is the only Son of God, exclamation point. Matter of fact, done. Whereas boomers were like, well, Jesus, liar, lunatic, or Lord, it could be kind of a fun journey. They were a little bit more open to a little bit, but in the end, they know the right answer, but they like the idea of challenging it a bit, a tease, if you will. Gen Xers, proof that the historical Jesus is the biblical Jesus. So they're going to want extra biblical evidence. They want more of it. Have you ever seen someone do a presentation, for example, on the cross, how Jesus died and exactly what he went through and what the drops of blood were and how that's a scientific phenomenon and how the water and the blood came out together and how that's a scientific validation? That is speaking Gen Xers language. This is how they look at Scripture. That's how they're wanting to come across. So if you're wanting to reach them, you need to put elements of that into your sermons, into your evangelism, and how you go about it. Millennials, because of their openness to all the different world religions and exposure that's happened from the boom of the internet, would you consider that Jesus might be God's only Son? You see, they're wanting a more open-ended version in general. They're more like, yeah, but I've got friends that are really good people and they're Buddhists or Hindus or whatever they are. And I have seen this overseas. It's the same in other countries. It varies a little bit on the age spans because these generations are a little bit more specific to North America. But they have a more open-ended there. Gen Zers, Jesus is the friend you've never had and will never lose. We're speaking one Bible verse. But notice how differently you're portraying it in each generational language. None of them are bad. Is anything in that statement wrong? No. But in one way, you're speaking a generational language that is going to reach them better than the other. Because Gen Zers, we have more mental health issues than ever before. In fact, I just got a book called The Anxious Generation: How the Rewiring of Childhood Has Totally Changed America. Because there is a high level of anxiety because they have, who was yesterday talking about the parasocial relationships. So they've created these relational dynamics that aren't really based on reality. When they've done studies in Loma Linda, when I was down there for some classes, we were talking with some of the counselors, Bible teachers, and whatnot from our own university. And when we asked them, so what is the biggest struggle amongst the people today? And one of the things they said was, well, most of our young people come to us and they want to know how to have friends and have solid relationships. Now, these people were hooking up with people of the opposite gender and sleeping around and doing all kinds of different things. They had lots of followers and friends on social media, but they were deprived of authentic relationships. So it's not that they aren't connecting, but their way of connecting that they've accepted from society is leaving them with a void. And so we can come to them and answer the void by phrasing and learning the language. Let's see, Daryl Hall's book, Speaking Across Generations. Great little book if you just want a simple book to get a little bit of everything on the generations. He calls it generational polyglots. So a polyglot is someone who speaks multiple languages. So you need to become an expert in the languages and cultures and customs of the people you're actually ministering to. Makes pastoring a little harder, right? So I look at that and I go, how am I supposed to keep this in mind with every single sermon and evangelistic series? What I have found is I'm not going to hit all of them every time. I'll be straightforward. I'm tending to go to my own generation. So I'm Gen X, probably more so than I am millennial, which came after me. I didn't have this belief. So I present things in much more of a Gen X way. And most of us, because that's how we learn and that's what we need, we will present within our own generational language. Does that make sense? So it's easier to connect to and communicate to people similar minded in thinking as you are. When they're different, we don't often know and we get hung up. And it's amazing. One of the things I see happen over and over and over again in churches is generational slamming. There was a phrase, there's an article out of the Adventist, I forget what the publication was, it was in British Columbia, where there was a phrase that was popularized where they would just, young millennials were going to boomers in the church, and their response was, okay, boomer, and they would just say this repeatedly to them, like dismissing them, writing them off entirely. And in the same way, I have seen, in fact, I just asked one of our other presenters, when you're doing evangelistic series, I think there is a benefit in having people read the Bible, but don't down them if they're using their phone. If you're downing young people for using the Bible on their phone, this is how they access everything. They say one of the worst things you can do to a young person in today's society, the greatest punishment, and they're tempted to commit suicide if you take away their phone. That's how bad it is. What's interesting is in some Barna research and whatnot, they've actually found that they know they spend too much time on the phone. They know it's not good for their health. They know what it's causing, mental health issues, but that isn't changing the fact that they don't want you to touch it. So it's fascinating. They know they're drinking from a poisoned well and they can't help it. They're so addicted to it.
That's sin.
It is.
For all of us.
This is what sin is. But
Whatever our thing is.
So each of us have our own thing, but generations have general sin tendencies that are different from the others. They're tempted in different ways.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
How many boomers smoke cigarettes even though they know it's cancer sticks?
Correct.
Cancer sticks. Whereas Gen Zers don't typically get into
They don't get into it.
smoking, cigarettes.
So they're different. But when we recognize where they're at in their developmental process and what they're going through, one of the things that becomes very important when you're back in your home churches is these youngest generations. Because they're still developing and deciding their own individual identity. And so making sure they have an identity that is embedded with a concept of who they are in God changes everything. And one of the things that they've found that makes the biggest difference in retention, so we're talking about retention of young adults to go clear through college and whatnot, is the number of intergenerational connections they have. In other words, how many people are they connected to in their faith context outside of their family and outside of their generation? If they're connected with grandmas and grandpas or aunties and uncles or whatever you want to call other people within the faith context, when they get to that point where they don't want to talk to mom and dad about their questions about faith, they know what mom and dad think, they know what mom and dad believe, but they're going through a natural process where they have to individualize their faith, right? We all went through it to some degree. And if they don't want to ask mom and dad, but they have no connections to anybody in the church that isn't of their age, they go with their age, which tends to bleed over from popular culture outside of the church. Are you following? So when they have those friendships and dynamics that are with people of other different generations, it broadens the perspective. And I actually full-heartedly believe that the church is not truly being the church unless we're engaging all generations. If not, you can go to 1 Corinthians and read through where Paul talks about the head and the arms and the this and the eyes, the body of Christ, right? If you take that and put a generational lens on it, what if you detached and cut off all Gen Zs? Cut off all the silent. So when we make a church that is primarily targeted towards only one generation, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I've seen churches start this way. I've seen a church start and they literally said, if you're over 35, you can't come here. I've also I've heard of another church where it was 65 plus only. They didn't want kids, they were too noisy. You're signing your death. I mean, it's just a matter of time. What was interesting with the group that started with young believers is as they began to grow and get a little older and get married and have kids, that age somehow just kept getting a little higher and higher because they didn't want to leave the group, but they couldn't keep to the age range because now the next generation was coming up and they were different. So most of us relate really well to our own generation, and usually we do pretty well with one below and one above. Anytime you get beyond that, we have such a difference in the way we think and do life that it's hard to relate. Simply put, right? So how do you get a millennial to sit down with a boomer and have a healthy conversation? How do we do it? How do we go about it? Do they recognize that they're both bringing things to the table? Is there an openness in where we can have a dialogue, where it's not so much of a matter of fact, recognizing that if you do the Jesus is fact here, you might lose them before you ever have the conversation. So this is what I mean by generational intelligence, looking at who the generations are. And I mean, you don't have to become an expert, but you can get some basic knowledge of who the generations are, what some of their preferences are, and what it looks like. So this was hearing John 3:16. Here's one for an offertory appeal. So if you're going to give offering, here's another one. So if you are doing the offering, how the generations give is very different. And you can see this super clearly if you look at some of the results from the General Conference. So the older generation, very systematic givers. It's time to give what he is due, God what he is due. This is second nature. We don't think about it. It goes straight to God because that's what we were raised as, right? And praise the Lord for those people, or we'd probably have to close a lot of our churches. So I read one author, he called it what did he say? So he's got the funders is what he calls them. But that to me strikes me wrong, because if all you want out of them is their money, what's in it for them? Why would they go? We're just supposed to fund whatever you want to do so you can have drums, or you can have this, or you can have that. That doesn't sell well. I find many times when you come in, especially if it's a fairly traditional church, more the pews, hymns variety, if you start talking about some of these things, a lot of the older members get a little nervous, if not scared, that you're transitioning them out. You're just going to push them out because it's all going to be youth-oriented. The opposite extreme is the youth come and they say, well, everything you preach and everything you do is all about the older generation. We can't be on the board. We have no say. When we say something, you don't listen. And so where do we belong? Why are we even here? Fair? So here, it's time to give God what he is due, but boomers, giving is part of worship, isn't it? There's that little tease, the isn't it? So it's a part of the worship. Gen Xers want statistics and testimonies on the benefits of giving. So we're a Gen X coming from this perspective. I can say, yeah, if you start telling me all that happens with the money, all the ways it goes, all the ways Adra is able to multiply it, and I get a testimony of what it did to those kids in Africa that you gave the money to, I'm more likely to give it naturally. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just different. Millennials, generosity was a value of Jesus that impacted everything he did and said. So they can look up to Jesus. They might be more open to other views of Jesus, other views of God, but in most of them, they see God and Jesus as a great role model. Whether they consider him God is a whole nother thing, but many of them, the majority would say, well, Jesus was a good person that did good things for people. So if he's a role model, you can pick up on the role model about a dialogical way of looking at this. When you get to Gen Zers, Jesus values you and me more than anything we could give to him because they don't feel valued. They don't feel they have a place. They're struggling with depression and anxiety and many other things. So how you give even the offertory. So what I often have done when I did that helped me in my churches was I tried to get people of all generations involved in the service. So we actually created an intergenerational worship committee where we got someone from each generation together. And we said, how could we improve this? How could we help here or there? And we got all their ideas. And then as a committee, we actually decided some things to try. And I will tell you, when we did this for 1 month, so it wasn't overwhelming to the congregation to change stuff constantly, but add or change a small dynamic. Some of the things we tried failed miserably and we never reinstituted them. So one of the things they wanted was just have the deacons at the back rather than collecting up and down, for example. They thought, well, that just feels like you're begging for money. So we said, okay, well, we'll try it this way. Didn't work well at all. The kids were totally confused. When we had the kids offering it, it went so out of sync from what the service normally was that we ended up reinstituting it. Other things where I would say if you're up there singing, if you have praise teams or choristers or whatever you use, if they have children or grandchildren, get them up there. I have not been to a church yet where you get young kids up there singing when everybody's not smiling. It's just adorable. If they do a Jesus Loves Me special music, we had that a little while back in my church with a mom and daughter. The daughter was 3, saying Jesus Loves Me. I think there was a louder roar of applause for that than we had a professional pianist with there. There's something to getting all of the generations involved, finding ways to plug them in. So one of the things I will do is we will have, some of these are real simple ways to plug them in. For example, do you have junior deacons or junior deaconesses where they're being mentored and trained with someone outside of the family? These are great types of cross-cultural dynamics where you're cross-breeding there, where you're mentoring. And one of the things important, if you're going to talk about mentoring in your churches, make sure it's both sides. So the younger kids have a great way of teaching the older people things too, as long as you're both open-minded. How many, when I've asked the question in my congregation, how many that are over 60, when you need help with your phone or technology, who do you call? Grandkids. They can come up and figure it out in a couple of seconds when it might take them an hour to figure it out. So this is an area where they have a stronger suit. So if your young people want to be a part of ministry, you start asking them and dialoguing with them, what would that look like? So I've typically told my congregations that if you have an idea about a ministry, find a partner, find someone else that agrees with what you're thinking, then find a mentor, typically an elder or the pastor. Give it a shot. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, that's okay. It's not a failure. We learn what not to do. We just move on, punt, pivot, and keep moving. And if it does take off and do really well, then we'll make it official. The church will get behind it. We'll have funding available, whatever is needed. And usually it happens very quickly if it's successful. Being much more open. So, for example, this last week I did a ministry fair. Have you ever been to a ministry fair in an Adventist church? Ever heard of it? So we had every ministry of the church had a table. We talked about being the church. What does it mean to belong and how to be a part? Last year I had over 40 baptisms and we spent $12,000 in evangelism. The next closest growth in my conference, there was a church that had 50 baptisms. They spent between $300,000 and $400,000 to get that. So this doesn't have to be super expensive. I recognize most of our churches are on a budget. We don't have a lot of money. Those of you like in Idaho, the Mormon church is really good. They have actual, youth wards and different things. They're plugged in everywhere. So Pathfinder groups is a great way to reach out. But you've got to integrate and find ways to plug people of all ages in. If you're not doing that, you're not likely to keep them or reach them in the same level. Any questions thus far?
What did you call that?
Ministry fair. And one of the things I always do with the ministry fair when I had the booths, it was interesting. When we put them all up, I always have one that what ministry is missing. Ideas that you might be willing to lead. One of them that came out this last week, and it's supposed to start this week, is a shooting ministry. Now, some Adventist churches, that would be maybe a no-no. To me, I'm like, look, if people in the church are willing to get together outside of church hours, hang out, be spiritually minded, and do something they all enjoy, fine, let them go to the shooting range. I don't care. So we are a little bit more open-minded where I would say, what's the old axiom? You marry the message, you date the method. So the method of getting the message to them can modify a little bit, but you don't give up on the true values of what we believe. And that has to be clear, particularly when you're talking to the older generations. They're scared you're just going to dummy down Adventism. You don't have to dummy down Adventism to reach younger people and to do it in a solid way. But it helps to know where they're coming from, where their language is. So
I mentioned to some of the people in my church that we have people that are into rocks. I'm into fabricating. Other people are into concrete. And mentioned that we should take our youth and say, hey, if this is something that we're going to do, we're going to take a Sabbath afternoon after services, and we're going to go over to so-and-so's house and learn how to do rocks.
there you go.
And it's really hard to get somebody on board to do that.
They have to recognize the purpose behind it isn't purely the rocks. It's the relationships.
Yeah, and the person that is in the rocks, he's in that Gen Z earlier.
Yeah.
You know, and of course the kids are millennials.
Yeah, and you have to get a little bit creative. A lot of the times I find rather than trying to figure out what the youth want, it's better just to ask them. Have a conversation with them. What do you want in the church? Well, that might not work. Can you see, like, for example, one of the things, I had a young person that wanted to help sing. Now, their version of song service was not customary to this particular congregation. They were much more contemporary. The way she dressed, the way she sang, the songs she chose, I think the majority of the congregation were uncomfortable and couldn't sing the songs. So she got up and she did this song service where it was all contemporary. And when she was done, she was so frustrated and felt so judged that she said, I am never getting up there again. That was her response to me. And I had just done a series of sermons on the generations, and I spoke on it right after that. So I was in the midst of this. And one of the older people came up and said, you know, I really appreciate that you felt comfortable enough to express, even if it's not my favorite. And she said, the reason why I like him, so this older person began to then just say, the reason why I like it is I've lost pretty much everything and everybody in my life. My friends, my family, funerals are a normal thing. She was in her 90s. She said, church is the only place where I go where it hasn't changed. This young girl started crying and said, I'm going to be more flexible. We're going to sing hymns next time, plus the others. So it wasn't one dominant style. It was a mix. There was some contemporary, and some people, contemporary means 90s. Some people, contemporary means it's on the radio and it just came out last week. And that partly is depending on the skill set of your church, but they began to work together. And what fascinated me is what looked like a total tragedy between the oldest and the youngest generations involved in the church cultivated into a beautiful friendship. She began to look at this old lady like her grandma, and she didn't want to hurt her grandma. And this is what I mean by intergenerational, bringing the generations together in such a way that it's like a family. If you have the idea, and this is where Ellen White even counsels on the really large churches because you lose the family feeling. And so here, this is an older book here, and it gets quoted a number of times, but if you really think about it, it's quite true. The church is the only agency in Western civilization which has all the members of the family as part of its clientele through the complete life cycle from birth to death. Who has infants and people in their hundreds in one place at the same time consistently? The church is about the only place left. We have a unique privilege. One of the things they are finding is bringing the generations together from just a sociological perspective is really getting traction. So much so in Seattle, one of the number one nursing homes up there did something kind of crazy, and they put a preschool in the middle of it. Because they found the preschoolers loved all the older people loved them, and the health rate went up over everybody. The kids were learning more, they were learning faster, the older people were getting better, they had greater joy and purpose, and they helped in different things, all by doing this from a secular perspective. Yet here we are as a church, we have this unique opportunity where they're all part of our clientele and we're not really utilizing it. Most of our churches may have people from many different generations present, but they're not interacting outside of their home family group. So this is where we end up, where we have divisions amongst us and we're not even aware of them. And so Paul's saying we shouldn't have divisions among us, that we be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. So to me, this starts, if you're looking at the generations, it starts with the leaders first, and then maybe the elders, the board, and kind of broaden out. Because if you don't have the support of anybody else in your church, you're going to be crucified. That's just in general how it goes in churches. So you need to have the support of some leaders around you to recognize. What I have found in my experience, though, is when I start sharing some of these materials and some of these things, the older people want their kids and their grandkids in the church. And the younger people want to be a part of the church and feel like they belong. And when they begin to see each other in a way that they're not going to be downing each other or criticizing each other, and we're in this together and we're one family, all of a sudden the dynamics change. The infighting stops. And so, but it takes some work to get there. It has to be a core value, if you will, to do this in order for it to last long term. So in this case, he said, there are contentions among you. So one of the challenges in bringing the generations together, as I just said, is that the generational cultures and preferences clash. If any one generation dominates, the rest are inclined to leave. This is what, as an Adventist church, we have done at large. We've had one or two generations dominate the thinking, the practices, and how we go about things with no room for flexibility that has left younger generations simply leaving. I'm not saying that we don't include those older things. And this is where this becomes very pivotal, is you're not doing away with the old, but you're including the new. So this is where it's really for all generations. So just to give you a little bit of terminology in this, so monogenerational is one generation dominates in all decision and interacts with those who are like them in an age and thinking. If you go to cross-generational, one generation speaks to another generation intending to replicate their faith in another group. This is what I see more often. We'll talk to you, we'll share with you, and we want you to look like little mini-me's. Your faith should look just like ours. Faith is dynamic, and it looks different in different generations. And so there's got to be a little bit of more of an openness to this than just trying to create little clones. You've got to have some openness for them to take that faith and mold it and shape it in a way that makes sense to them. Multi-generational, so our larger churches are mostly multi-generational. This term gets confused with intergenerational. So many generations in one place, but little or no intentional interaction between generations outside one's family. This is the next step. So it's kind of like going from worst in health level, and we're getting a little healthier and a little healthier. But if you really want to do it well, you become intergenerational. So this is what I got my doctoral dissertation in. I was the first to graduate from Andrews, and Andrews was the first to put the program out there. So it's a fairly new thing in a sense, but it's really getting back to the way God's always done church. If you look at through Scripture, you find the gatherings brought all people from all ages together, and it was done in such a way that you were to tell the stories to the next generation and so on and so forth. What we see in like the Gospels, when the children come to Jesus and Jesus getting after them, when they try to get the kids away, is where it starts going sideways. So one of the things, and I don't have time in this presentation, but if you actually go look at the Elijah message, you're familiar with the third Elijah concept? Everybody here familiar with that concept? So you have the first Elijah in the Old Testament. John the Baptist becomes the second Elijah, preparing for the first advent of Christ. The third Elijah would be preparing for the final advent of Christ. So what you have in this is if you get to the very last book of the Old Testament and you get the last 2 or 3 verses, it talks about he would send an Elijah figure at the end of time. And it's very specific in the way it's worded, that is the great and destructive day. This is speaking not of the first coming, but of the second coming. And one of the key points of that is it would turn the hearts of the fathers towards the children and the hearts of the children towards the fathers. In other words, there was intergenerational reconciliation. It's something we've often missed. We assume it's going to happen. I find this is typical in any family. This becomes even more prominent if you have minority groups. So what happens if, for example, I'll give you an example of the way one church has handled this. If you go to Loma Linda, it's a huge church, that the Korean Adventist church there. So huge that it has 3 full-blown sanctuaries. 3. The reason being is they have one church for first-generation Koreans, one for what they call a 1.5 generation, meaning maybe they were born in Korea as an infant and brought over, and then the second generation, which were born here, and they've now taken on a Western culture and not the culture of their parents and grandparents. Because it kind of fades, it doesn't happen instantly. So when you have, and this is really bad about in some cultures like the Indian culture, the idea of going to dances, some of these different things, arranged marriages, there's huge cultural differences. So in that place, they have 3 totally separate services, 3 totally separate ways of doing church, because they cannot get them to agree at all. So the one in the middle has English and Korean. The first generation, the older version, is very, very formal and all Korean, and then you get second generation is all English. To me, this is a tragedy. These are all family members, all in one place, and they can't even go to church together because they're so fixated on their differences. So they're not looking at what brings them together, they're looking at what tears them apart. And then we end up being a house divided. So as churches, in many ways, this is actually easier in smaller churches, which is different. A lot of the methods and models that I find when I've gone to presentations like this in Propel are easy to implement in a large church with a great big budget and a lot of people. This is something you can do in a small church. This is something where you're connecting all the different people. So I've done this in a small, a medium, and a large church. And everywhere I've gone, it's succeeded. One of the things I've often started is I've said, to my elders to start with, I want you to think about a young person you can truly have a cross-mentoring relationship with. You're going to invest in their life. You're going to be there to help them, to guide them, obviously with the parents' consent. But pray about it and figure out if there's someone you naturally connect with. I don't assign it, because assigning it, people feel weird about that, getting assigned to an elder. It just doesn't feel very natural. So they will make those relationships. And then those kids, when they have questions, who do you think they're going to ask? And what are the chances that leader is going to be able to guide them through much better their chances of staying in the church is much higher. So this has implications for retention on a huge level, but as you integrate some of these elements in the languages like we talked about, it has huge ramifications for how you do evangelism. How you market and what does your marketing look like and what platforms is it on is going to dictate to some degree who's coming. A lot of, I think I mentioned my daughter was ready to just watch TikTok for, instead of reading what to expect when you're expecting, she'll just watch TikTok videos. I find that a little mind-boggling, but that's the way they think. And so if you're wanting to get those generations, do you have any kind of presence in their sphere of influence? So they look at information very differently in the younger generations because they are bombarded with information. I mean, what can't you find on YouTube, right? It's all there, everything. And so it's more about filtering information and reliable sources. Are you a safe and reliable source as a church? Because if they don't see you as that, and if you don't have a voice into some of those areas, you're not a valid source of input on how they do life. So this is a little bit like what Larry was talking about as being influencers. Do you have a presence? It may be totally outside of your realm of capacity, right? So you're thinking, I can't be on TikTok. That would be me. I'm not a TikTok person. I don't even have a TikTok account. I recognize my daughter's on it. So I asked some young people, could you help us with this? We're a little clueless. And it's true. I was very open, transparent. I'd like to, but I don't know what to do. How could we do this? What would it look like? And they got all excited about all the things they could do. I just had to ask the right questions, get them thinking about it, and figure out how could you help your church tell the truth about who you believe God to be in the forums you're in. So this happens in all kinds of strange ways. One of the other ones that I saw happen when I brought this up was they did I forgot the name of it. There's a gaming platform where you, Discord? Yeah, I couldn't remember. Discord. So they made a Discord group for Adventist gamers. And they got in there and they were talking and doing different things and working together. They connect differently, but it's not wrong. It's just different. And then if they're building relationships that are outside of just that one group, then they're much more likely to end up coming back into the context. But they're going to want to know they have a place in your church. And I think one of the things we have to be very mindful about this when we're doing this is if your church board is not safe for a young person, you need to address that first before you invite them into a space like that.
I watched this morning, this little man, he couldn't have been this tall. He gets up on top of a seat and starts shutting off one of the cameras.
Yeah.
And taking it apart. And I was like, what is he doing? But he knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing.
There was other people that was like, wow, because we had no clue. Boy.
Yeah, I watched it happen. I was sitting right in front of him. And so it was actually the lead pastor's wife was on the camera. And this kid comes up and he's doing all these things. And it's like, he didn't even think about it.
No.
But he's ecstatic to be involved and have a place in that. So the PA booth is an easy way to do that.
We have some of our children doing it in the AV stuff.
The trick is sometimes if the parents aren't consistent in bringing them, and you have to create a culture where if something happens wrong, they don't get shamed for it.
That's where we're struggling with, because the older people are like, why isn't it on the board?
So if something goes wrong, and this is part of where you have to create a culture within your church. So I think Byron Corbett was talking about that a little bit ago in the main area, but you have to have a culture that will embrace them. And I mean, I've had, when I first started doing this, I remember I had a family that was visiting. They were not Adventist. They didn't have Adventist background. Their kids weren't raised in Adventist churches. They were loud, they were noisy, they were disruptive, and they were wanting to come to church. And when they came and their kids were loud, people kept turning around, shh, shh, to the kids. How do you think the mom felt? Does she belong there? No. So unless they look like us, act like us, think like us, talk like us, they're not welcome. But if that is all we're doing, we're a dying church. You're not going to grow. You can't bring your community into an environment. So I had to get pretty hard on my leaders that this is not tolerable. It's not going to happen. I went and apologized to the woman that came, and I went to the older lady and I said, look, I love you and I want you here. But if you do that again, I'm going to ask you to leave from the pulpit if I have to. You can't tolerate it. If we are known by our love, take Jesus' own words, you better be loving them and not pushing them away. I'd rather they be here and be noisy than not here at all. And so in some ways, we're trying to do things differently so that we don't expect the same results by doing the same thing. But it's not doing things so differently that we've lost our message and our distinctiveness. It just means how we go about it, how we say it, how we involve them, getting their opinion on things and seeing how they can help. How can we integrate them? One of the most recent things I did was I have a kid that's fascinated. He's an 8th grader, but he is absolutely fixated with AI. So I asked him, could you make some graphics for me with AI? He was like, really? Like you'd use them in church? And I was like, yeah. Do it. I don't know which platform to use. I've just been using this or that. And he was just blown away that when I put it up there, I put his name at the bottom. Art by. He was recognized, he was appreciated, he was valued, and he belonged. And all I did was have him use a computer-generated software to make an image on the topic. This doesn't have to be hard. This doesn't have to be they're up there leading everything. One of the other things I did to bring in generations, every now and then I'll do a sermon that's much, much shorter and get some testimonies. So one of the ones I did, and I got 3 different generations. We did a Jonah topic of running from God when you know you shouldn't have. And each generation got up and shared how they ran away from God in a different way. I did not know what they were going to say. I did not get the entire details of what their testimony looked like, but I gave them a voice. Every one of those people are very connected now and loved and appreciated more by the members because now we know a little of their story. So it's building that relationship dynamic that's intergenerational, where you have comprehensive mutuality, equality, and reciprocity among the generations through joyful, intentional interaction. So a lot of words here, but comprehensive everywhere. Mutuality, it benefits everyone mutually. There's equality amongst the generations. We're all at the same field at the foot of the cross. Reciprocity among the generations through joyful and intentional interactions. This is not something that happens overnight. It's something that's cultivated. So one of the best ways to start building this, if you're wondering where to start, use your church socials. Socials are a great non-threatening environment. So we try to get things that are for each of the generations. So I've challenged my social committee leaders that they need to really integrate and find ways to get all the generations involved. If you have to talk to them, I mean, why are we so scared to talk to other generations about what they would want? It's amazing that we don't do it in church. We just assume, we make plans, and we hope they'll show up. In general, most churches I've been to, that's how it works. You put someone in charge, they make all the rules, they call all the shots, they do what they want to do, and then they hope people will come. Rather than doing that, we've gotten a little more creative. So we have a car show ministry, we have a motorcycle ministry, we have all kinds of weird ministries, you might say, but it draws a different crowd for each one. But it creates an environment where everybody is understood. I don't know if you want to go clear through these. I have some basic outlines of the generations I can give here. If you're not familiar with them, I'll just do a super quick overview of them. So the silent generation, also known as elders and builder generations, they are nationalistic and value economic security and strong family relationships in general. So this is kind of where they're coming from to give you a snapshot. They approach issues with purpose and are not excited about change. In fact, change is like a dirty word to them. You say we're going to change this, they immediately tense up because they're tired of the change. Technology is also often considered a dirty word. They don't like it. So they advocate hard work, commitment, and diligence, and most view technology as a nuisance. So this is kind of where they're at, where they're coming from. They favor absolutes. This is Jesus is Lord, absolute, linear, and make plans and stick to them. The favored leadership style of those the two generations, that should be the silent and the boomers, that we'll see in the next one, generations, is they want an authoritative pastor. They want someone that'll tell them what's right, what's wrong, and how to do it. Which gets very interesting because you get down to the younger generations and that is not what they want at all. In fact, one of the things we did what we called speed conversation. Have you ever heard of speed dating? Where you sit down and you get like 5 minutes. We did this as a church, the whole church. It was after the church service, we went into the fellowship hall and everybody got a name tag that didn't put their name on it, they just put their generation. And then we had clipboards with questions, and they went around in 2 circles, and they had 1 minute to ask the person the question on their piece of paper and write their answer in connection with their generation. And then we got all this feedback from all of them, and they realized I shared the results up on the screens a few weeks later. But to give you an example, like one of them that was a total polar opposite. The question was asked, which is more important? Not that one is not important, but which is more important, reverence in church or engagement in church? Younger generations, unanimous engagement. Oldest generation, unanimous reverence. But by letting them see that this was them, this is not some research from outside. This isn't somebody else's idea or perspective. This is our own conversations we're having here. They got to know them. They started asking questions why. I had people from 90 years old to about 15, 16 asking when they can do it again as soon as it finished. Because they enjoyed the conversations. They got to know their congregation in a whole new way. And I got some really interesting feedback that they could then now understand each other better and work together better in unity. So there's lots of ways to do this. That was just kind of a off-the-wall idea. Yeah? Just scratching? Any questions so far?
That was speed what?
Speed conversations. It's like speed dating, but you give them one theological question with 2 options, typically, or you can have them put, one of the others I had, which part of the worship service is most important to you? And so there was music, sermon, prayer, children's story, whatnot. It was interesting in that the sermon was the highest valued in the older generation, but the youngest generation, the most important thing was the music. What happened when we got into our dynamics where we had the worship committee from the different generations, the oldest generation was the most protective of the music of all areas, but it was the least value to them. Mm-hmm. That was the area where there was no budging. Right? Yeah. And yet it had the least value to them in the service. So I said, well, if this is really how it goes, and they're having this conversation, I'm just facilitating a group conversation. They said, well, maybe we need to give the younger people some more slack. They said it. I didn't say it. They just saw the answers. They came up with the conclusions together on how to better work that. And the younger group that was like, well, you don't need to be so dialogical and this and that. If it's going to offend them, why don't you just preach this way or that way and just do this and that? I mean, they were coming to the agreements together as a church on how they could do church better together to create a better church for the future. But it involved bringing them all together. But the beautiful thing with it is when you bring them all together like that, you're actually going to be more prepped as a congregation to invite people from any walk of life outside. So it's a general, universal, very broad picture. I don't think I'm going to go through all these because I think my time's running up pretty quick. A couple of quick books if you want them, and I can leave them up here. So Generational IQ, this is Hayden Shaw has a number of good books with it, but he's looking at Christianity Isn't Dying, Millennials Aren't the Problem, and the Future is Bright. So his book will go through, this is a great simple read if you want to understand a little bit about the generations in just like one quick read. He gives you a pretty broad one. He has another book that's more specifically, I left it in my car, that looks at the 10 areas that we pull apart as generations and how to bring them together and bridge it. So he's got some great books. Kind of, they almost refer to this amongst those that are focusing on intergenerationality as kind of like the Bible of it. Intergenerational Christian formation, how to form it, the values, community, worship, how to bring them together. This is kind of a Holly Allen is key on this. The languages and specific needs, looking at messages that satisfy boomers, Xers, millennial, and Gen Zs and beyond. He looks at the languages, he looks at how they want to say it, and this is surveys from them. So now you're looking at, this isn't what we think they want. This is specifically what they're saying. This one is Daryl Hall. You can come see all these afterwards too. James White, not the James White you're all familiar with, but another James White, Emery White, Meet Generation Z. He talks about how understanding and reaching the new post-Christian world and how he has to go about it. He has a church that's almost entirely Gen Z. I don't know that I agree with everything in how he goes about it because he really focuses on being pretty much mono-generational, more than intergenerational, but he has a lot of incredible insights with specifically Gen Z, which is going to be your youngest people. These are your young adults and high schoolers now. So these ones, in fact, he talks about in the back, he's got sample sermons on how he's addressed with people that were not straight, we'll just put it broad in those terms, how biblical sexuality is something we can talk about, and how does he put it? He says, in a conversation he had with one of them, you can't make your desire for a particular chemical release, because that's what we're talking about, trump God's law. So I understand it's difficult, but let's have an actual open-ended conversation. Know that I'm going to love you. You can come here. If you're abstaining from the action of intercourse with the same gender, then you are a tempted sinner just like everybody else in the church, and you should be able to come, attend, and even lead as long as you're not living the lifestyle, because it's the lifestyle that's the sin. That's going to make a lot of your older people very uncomfortable to even have that conversation. He also talks about spirituality. They're fascinated with spirituality. You go on Netflix, there's so many paranormal whatever. I don't even know what they all are. They're fascinated with it. It's a way you can draw them in on there is paranormal in Scripture. It's bad, but there's also a good side of it. It brings in the idea of the great controversy. Actually, I take what he has and I build from it, and I put the greater truth of the doctrines the Adventist Church have into it. So these will give you some just kind of general things about this. Let me see if there's anything else in here. So just on Gen Zs, again, it's a little less known, but 10 to 25. Technology-based, social media playing a strong role. They watch exactly who they want, when they want. They say that 10 seconds of boring is enough to lose a Gen Z viewer. 10 seconds. Talk about a challenge as a pastor. You're trying to reach male, female, all generations consistently, and you've got less than 10 seconds of boring or you're out. However, I will say, when you start thinking this way and planning and trying to conceptualize how and visualize people in your church, how they would respond to the message and the way you say it, you're going to get better and better and better as you practice on how to reach all generations. Because you're going to be thinking about them more. It's hard once I had that, when I look at the face of that young girl that wanted to quit because she got up and sang, and people were a little hard, and then I picture the grandmother she talked to, I cannot not see that face when I think about people. So when I'm speaking up front, I look around and you can see people of all ages, And it's going to remind you and make you think about, how do I need to word this for them? How can the Holy Spirit work through me right now, whether it's evangelism, whether it's a church sermon, whether it's a Sabbath school? You're just keeping in mind you're now equipped. When I was going to go into the mission field, they said the first 2 years you're worthless because you don't know the language and you're still learning the culture and customs. That was AFM. AFM said 2 years. So don't expect this to happen in 2 months. So it is a learning process, but be open and awakened to the concept that we need to learn more about these people, about these generations. Postmodern Children's Ministry says a church program can't spiritually form a child, but a family living in an intergenerational community of faith can. So you have the tools, you have the people, you just got to build the relationships and make it intentional. When we do this, I think we're going to have much greater success in all of our outreach, evangelism. It's pervasive because it's a church culture and a value that permeates all of our activities. So this is not just a simple, here, do this, do that kind of list. It's more keeping in mind who you're trying to reach. Know your audience better, rather than assuming they think and act and prefer things the way you do. This was a massive eye-opener to me. I can tell you that from a personal level, just to give you a story of this, I remember my daughter's coming back from college, and her responses to me in a conversation seemed rude, disrespectful, not the way I'd brought her up, harsh, and I really struggled with it. And quite frankly, I didn't respond to it very well. I'll just be honest. And it wasn't until I went through this that I realized that was the only way she felt she could be authentic. That's more or less what she told me. She said, to play like I'm not thinking and acting and feeling the way I am is not being true to who I am. So I began to learn who my own kids were. I began to learn how to reach them. I began to look past a tattoo or whatever it is that would normally have been a little bit off-putting, to put it simply, or maybe something that I would question is, why would they have that as a value? I just began to see it as it's different. I don't have to agree with all of it, but they are who they are and where they are. How can I reach them where they're at and help them take the next step of faith? And as we do that, I think it will continuously lead to all of us growing spiritually together. Any last questions, thoughts, concerns? Is it kooky? Crazy? I mean, to me, it made pretty common sense because they are in your church, but we don't know anything about them. So this is just trying to learn who they are.
In this conference, there's a lot of dysfunctional churches.
Which conference doesn't have a lot of dysfunctional churches?
That's exactly what you talked about. Can you take your presentation into these dysfunctional churches that have these warring groups of people? Could you have some sort of a presentation with these churches, and would it result in understanding or a Donnybrook of more contention?
That's a loaded question. I would never think it would be 100%. I did this for not Upper Columbia, Washington Conference last year. I did a generational intelligence kind of thing. So I've done, I think I called it regeneration. So how it brings renewal and revival and everything from the generations. So I have done them. I think it's broader. I have met with NAD leaders in children's ministry, youth ministries, adult ministries, marriage ministries. And one of the things we're really challenging them is, why aren't you talking to each other and working together? We need to stop isolating every ministry and integrating more ministry. And so we are having conversations on a broad level, but this is not so much of a, you just do this. I can't give you the 1, 2, 3 step process. I can give you some ideas and some tools. I think in a broader context, my dissertation, just to put it out there through Andrews, is I walked congregations through what they call a transformative learning process. That's just jargon for adult education, where you give them information that kind of shocks the system a little bit, makes them evaluate options, and then it's Mesro's transformative learning process. You can look it up. But I basically led them through the process to realize you guys are fighting against each other and you don't even mean to. You're losing your kids and your grandkids because you won't try to understand them. How can we do this better? And in the end, I was able to get them all to begin to see it. And as they began to see it, I got them to begin thinking a little differently, a little broader, a little more open. And quite honestly, the culture of the church, it's still the one I did most of my research in is very traditional. They had choristers. They didn't have praise teams. I think drums would have set them off. I'm now in a church that has drums, bass guitars, electric guitars, you name it, and they love it. So I've seen it work in both conservative and contemporary environments because it involves everybody and everybody's values and opinions. You're not going to get exactly what you want every week, but you know that even though it's not reaching you, you've been given enough information that you realize this is helping other people in my congregation, and we're growing together. So I can wait till next week to get a sermon that feeds me a little more. So it opens the mind to more of a concept of how we look at it. It begins to be more of a how do we help each other versus just pitting our differences against each other. There's no talking about how it's shameful to look at a Bible on a phone and how we need to open up paper Bibles or this song is above that song. I mean, most of that talking all went away just because they realized this is what we need to do. We want a church where our grandkids, from the older perspective, will come to church. We want a church where the pastor actually knows what they're going through because he's looked into their culture, their language, and how they go about things so that you can actually help them in ways we couldn't. Because most of the time they're gone. If I went all the way back to where how generations are formed, we react against the bad. That's what they're doing. They're reacting against the negative they saw in their parents. This is why you got Celebration Church came out in the boomers outside of the silent generation and its strict, sometimes legalistic environment. And so there's that swing, but recognizing we don't need to swing, we just need to transition together and figure out how to do it together. So I could do it. The problem is I can't get to every single church. I have a big church and a lot going on, and we're having baptisms constantly, and we have a lot of outreach and community service and different things. So, and we're planting a church. So, so we're planting a church with this as an inherent value in a weird way. We're doing a full-time business from indoor pickleball courts. Because pickleball is big in Washington, so it's a wide open space. So we're going to have it run 6 days a week playing pickleball, and then on Sabbath it turns into church. But it brings in people from every age and involves them and builds community. But it's self-sustaining and not draining of the church's coffers. So.
Expand on what you just said.
So we looked at building a church plant that most church plants are very financially draining. And so we decided if we could build a church plant and structure it in such a way that the community was already coming to us. We didn't have to invite them into a meeting. They're already there. So we named it Heavenly Courts. We're in the process of getting the person to design the interior, but we had 3 pickleball courts back to back with a stage. So during the week when they have tournaments, the stage and the big screen up behind is for keeping score and who's winning. And they're in there playing pickleball, but it's just a flat space. And so we then convert it into a church. But it pays for itself because it's getting $15 to $20 an hour per person for every person playing in there. And then the other rooms that have individual courts for private courts, those become the Sabbath schools. But it's an entrepreneurial business church plants model, or third space model is another one. They have the dry bars and different things like that. It's a concept where your community is already coming to you and you can reach out. I've talked with the mayor. We can work with the public schools, senior centers, give them discount per day. They come to us. but everything about the setup, the design, the decorating, it's still a church, but it's a pickleball place. So it's just finding another way to do a church plant that doesn't kill the church it came from or drain it so much.
Reflection practice is so powerful, which is why we emphasize it so much at the Propel conference. So stop for a moment, think about the information that Dr. Canfield shared and how it could be applied to your own ministry. What was the big idea for you? How will you apply this in your ministry? What are you inspired to do? What action will you take? And when this episode finishes in another minute or two, I encourage you to pause for 5 or 10 minutes and just let your mind wander, reflecting on what you've heard. This reflection time can be really powerful. Well, that's it for this episode. We'd love to hear from you. You can send an email to podcast@propelconference.org. And please mark your calendar for next year's Propel Conference coming to Tacoma, Washington, April 27 to 30, 2025. Special thanks to Dr. Jason Canfield for speaking at the 2024 Propel Conference and to the Oregon Conference for sponsoring this episode. This has been the Propel Podcast, inspiration and innovation to grow your church. The Propel Podcast is produced by the crew at Sermon View, and the event recording services were provided by Adventist Learning Community. I'm Larry Witzel, wishing you God's richest blessing in your evangelistic journey. Please join us again next time for another episode of the Propel Podcast.